And Elisha, in quite calm fashion in 2 Kings 6, tells him, calm down. And he prays that God, open his eyes, let him see what I can see. And so his servant's eyes are open. He looks around, and he sees all of these chariots of fire surrounding him. And I love this. He tells him, he says, don't worry, greater are those who are with us than those who are with them. And his ability to be able to see that what God was doing was there to protect him, and indeed God was going to protect his man and his people. That is essentially the prayer of Zechariah chapter 6. The hope of this last vision is that we'd be able to see things the way that God sees them and understand that greater is he who is with us than he who is in the world, than he is who with them. That we'd be able to do just like Elisha did and have our eyes open this morning by Christ and be able to say, yes, the world is mighty, but our God is mightier. Yes, the world is terrifying, but our God is bigger. And that's what Zechariah chapter 6 is about. We come to Zechariah 6, we see the end of these visions. Zechariah's been having these multiple visions on one night. This guy is not getting any sleep at all. It's just one vision after other. There's a series of 8 of them. Now, many of them, particularly the first 4, they're quite encouraging. And there's quite a few similarities between the first vision and this last vision. However, once we begin to dive into it, you begin to see that the first 4, while very encouraging to God's people, the last 4 are not so encouraging to God's enemies because of what God is going to do to them. Particularly, you see the parallel between the first vision that we find in chapter 1 and the last vision that we find in chapter 6. Chapter 6 is a fulfillment of what God has said in Zechariah chapter 2, verse 13, that God has been roused to action. So what happens when God is roused to action? Well, God is going to deal with wickedness among his people, and he's going to deal with wickedness among the nations. In doing so, he reminds us how God actively cares for his people. Now, as we read this, I'll just remind you this is a vision, and a lot of these visions, it uses metaphorical images and language, and so we are not free to make up anything we want and how they represent. We have to have some contextual reasons for making that up, and that's what we're going to attempt to do this morning. So look with me in Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1, the 8th vision. Again, I lifted my eyes. That's been his refrain throughout this. It's like I looked up and I saw this vision, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black horses, the third white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled horses, all of them strong. Then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, what are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said to me, these are going out to the 4 winds of heaven, or depending on the translation, it may say the 4 spirits of heaven, after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. The chariot with the black horses goes towards the north country, the white ones go after them, and the dappled ones go toward the south country. When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. And he said, go patrol the earth. So they patrolled the earth. And then he cried to me, behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country. Along with Zechariah, we ask, what in the world are these? Well, we are reminded through this vision how God actively cares for his people. God indeed takes the divine initiative and control over all the events of the earth. So we're given this image of 2 bronze mountains. And we, again, have to ask, what are these? What are these there? Now, there have been different explanations given for what these bronze mountains are. Just outside of Jerusalem, you have the Kidron Valley, and on each side of the Kidron Valley, you have the Mount of Olives, and you have Mount Zion. And some people have said that this is a picture of perhaps Mount Zion and the Mount of Olives when the sun first comes up and hits those, and it's sort of the mountainsides look like bronze. I don't think that's probably a good interpretation for several reasons. One is, this is not talking about a new day or a new sunrise. This is talking about a new era in which God is going to do something totally and completely different. The other reason I don't think that that's a good interpretation is because the whole context of Zechariah is a rebuilding of the temple. They're coming there to reestablish the worship of God and restore the community of God by rebuilding the temple. So it has to do probably something to do with the temple. Well, the closest, best understanding of that is Solomon's temple. When we look at Solomon's temple in 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 13 through 22, we see that there's a description of bronze pillars as you enter into the temples. Matter of fact, they have names. One of them is named Jachin, which means he establishes. The other one is named Boaz, which means in him is strength. So in Solomon's temple, when you enter into it, you would enter into through these bronze pillars. But these aren't just bronze pillars. These are bronze mountains. These are significantly larger. They're huger. Huger. That's not a word. See, I told you, I'm not thinking right. They're much larger. I'm going to blame whatever cough medicine I'm taking. They're much larger. I'll catch that later. They're much larger than a pillar. They're mountains. They're significant in their size. And what comes from them are these four winds, or these angelic beings. So what we'd argue is we're probably getting a picture of the heavenly temple, of an entrance from that. In other words, of the presence of God that is there, something greater than just an earthly temple. Bronze in the Old Testament was a very expensive and mighty alloy. Throughout the Old Testament, it would represent the sureness and resoluteness of God in judgment. We would see bronze on the altar. We would see the bronze snake that the children of Israel used throughout the wilderness. We'd see in the New Testament, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 15, and Revelation chapter 2, verse 18, that Jesus has bronze feet as he's dealing in judgment with his church. It seems to represent the impregnability and the immutability fixed on the character of God's kingdom. So it's sort of like this vision as an entrance into God's kingdom or God's heavenly temple. If you're going to have a greater picture, not just an earthly temple, but a greater picture of a heavenly temple, this would be the entrance into it. So what comes forth from that? Well, out of that come these four chariots in verse 1 from between the two mountains. And so the mountains were made of bronze, and then we get this description of their color. One of them is red, one of them is black, one of them is white, and one of them is dappled. They go forth from heaven to wage war. Again, this is a response. In Zechariah chapter 2, verse 13, we read that the Lord has been roused from his holy dwelling, that God is getting ready to do something. We back up to the first vision in Zechariah chapter 1, and we see that the Lord has sent out his scouts, his horses, to patrol the earth, and he's upset that the earth is at rest because they are doing wickedness, and they're at peace in their wickedness. So you have an earth that is at peace in their wickedness. Now God from his holy dwelling has been roused to do something, and we see that God is going to send forth his chariots. The chariots of that day were considered to be what would be tanks of today. They were considered to be the most powerful weapon in the land that were used for speed and force during times of war. And these chariots are driven by the winds of heaven, so to speak, as Zechariah lays out in Zechariah chapter 6. The closest parallel that we get to this is the passage that we read in Revelation at the beginning of our service, in Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Now, it is not a direct parallel. It is not a one-for-one, but both of them are written in apocalyptic fashion, in the fashion of a vision, and so there are quite a bit of similarities between Revelation 6 and Zechariah 6. In Revelation 6, the red horse is the one that brings martyrdom and blood to this earth. The black horse brings famine and pestilence. The white horse brings victory. And the pale horse, or the dappled horse, is the horse of death. So now we see these horses that are going out that bring about God's omniscience and God's omnipresence upon the earth, using his divine initiative to bring about his will. God, the easier way of saying this, God's sending out his cavalry to do his will upon the earth. And so by sending these forth from heaven, we see God's divine initiative and control over all earthly things. He was working out his will through his agents. Now he's sending them out to do his bidding, and they are quite impatient to go out and do it. This is ongoing. God still does this. God still exercises divine initiative and control over all earthly events and earthly aspects. From a theological perspective, we talk about this as being God's providence. God's providence is God's initiative in the world. Now, in the past, we would probably call this luck. We would say things like, perhaps you've ever been on a long journey and you pulled off on the side of the road, or you pulled off to get gas, and you stopped to get gas, and your kids took forever to go to the bathroom because that's what kids do, and they finally get in the car, and then you get back on the interstate, and you see this giant wreck right in front of you, and you go, whoo, how lucky are we that the kids took longer in the bathroom, and how lucky is it that we weren't involved in that giant wreck? Previous generations would say that's not luck. That's the providence of God. That's God's divine initiative working in your life to orchestrate events for your good and your care and your protection. And that's what we would say, is that God providentially cares for his creation, but specifically providentially cares for his people. This answer is a great question for us, because I know if you're like me, you often struggle with this question: is God too big to care? In other words, we know that God is distant. We know that God is almighty. We know that he is transcendent. We know that he is omniscient. We know all these things about God, but certainly he is too distant, too far, too great to care about little old me, this little old speck of dust here. God's providence would say, no, that's not true. That God is not just distant and transcendent and far off. God is immanent and close, and God is perpetually, actively working in relation to his creation, sustaining all things. You know how I know this is also true? Because Jesus preaches on this in the New Testament. He reminds his disciples, he said, don't worry about what you're going to eat or drink. Don't worry about what you're going to wear. He said, look at the birds in there. Look at the little sparrows. God makes sure they're fed. Look at the lilies of the field. God makes sure they're clothed. How much more important are you than little bitty sparrows and little bitty lilies on the field? Jesus reinforces this idea of God's providential care in our life. And yet we go through life worrying about all sorts of things. I debated about how I should say this morning, but I'm gonna say this the best way I can. Do any of you struggle with worry? Stop it. Just stop. That's the best way I can say it. I don't know any nicer way to say it. Just stop worrying. Stop worrying, because God cares for you. God providentially cares for you. There's no reason for you to worry about tomorrow or what may come, because the God of the universe, who is magnificent and glorious in all things, has got your back. Don't worry. And so as our Creator God bears this perpetual active relation to creation, it is the providence of God, his initiative among us. And this is what we're seeing in Zechariah chapter 6, that God is not just a distant God, but he is an immanent God. He is sending his agents to work out his will providentially among his people. God is doing this fundamentally in Zechariah chapter 6 to judge the wicked of the world. Now, we looked at last week the vision of the basket of wickedness being taken away from God's people, and how wickedness will be removed from God's people. Now God is going out to the nations, those who do not belong to him. And he is going to deal with them and judge them and bring all the things that are wrong in this world and make them right. Now understand this as we look particularly here at verse 7. When the strong horses came out, they were impatient to go and patrol the earth. It is not a matter of if God will judge the earth. It is a matter of when. And the agents of God aren't sitting idly by going, oh, maybe we'll get up and do it today. God is restraining them and holding them back. And they are obediently and expectantly waiting to set things right. They are only restrained by God's patience. God does take divine initiative and control over all events of the earth, and that even includes judging the wicked. So perhaps you're here today and you're not a Christian, you're not a believer. Perhaps you're an atheist or you're an agnostic, or you've just got questions, or you haven't come to the faith. We're so glad that you're here. We hope you come back, and you're welcome anytime to come to this church. You are a welcome guest here today. But we want you to know this. Just because God hasn't judged or dealt with your sin yet, doesn't mean that he's going to let it go on forever. God is going to deal with it one day, and the only reason that it hasn't happened is because God's restraint, God's patience, his long suffering has withheld that judgment upon you. Perhaps, praying, hopefully, for the day of grace upon your life. So we as believers, we'd say God's providential care upon our life, that one day he's going to set all things right. All the things that are messed up in this world are going to be made right by God's divine initiative. But all the things that are messed up in this world includes those who are not believers in Jesus Christ. Do not be fooled into thinking that because God is slow to act, that God won't act. God will. Because of that, God punishes those who attack his people, and he judges the enemies of the church. Again, this is not a sermon I desire to preach, and I hope it does not come across as arrogant or cocky. But the Bible teaches that God will deal with the enemies of his people. These horses are waiting to go forth to deal with those who had attacked the people of God. Now, there is some question about where they go and who they are. Now, my translation says this in verse 5. These are going out to the four winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. That word winds in Hebrew is ruah. It's the same word that we get the word spirit from. It's often translated in the Old Testament as spirit. It can be translated either as wind or spirit, ruah. So some translations will translate this, they go out to the four spirits of heaven or the four winds of heaven. I think in this particular context, winds is a better translation. The reason why I say that is because these are indeed represented as angels that are going out to judge. And they are going out with God's wind at their back. In other words, they're going out swiftly and expediently. The question is, where do they go? And some of your, depending on what translation you have, your translators may have actually made a decision about this. You see, some translations, they read this and they would say that one went north, one went south, one went east, one went west. In Hebrew, it actually only says that they went north and south, and they tried to fill in the understanding of the compass. So is it a picture of that they're going to all 4 points of the compass? In other words, the whole earth, or are they just going north and south? I think there's a good reason to understand that these particular horses here are going north and south, but certainly represent God's omniscience and omnipresence over the entire earth. The reason we say that is because you just look at a map of Israel. It's essentially a land bridge between the north and the south, between Egypt in the south and all the enemies that they face in the north. So all the enemies of God came from the north, essentially, at this time in history. Egypt has long passed the scene of being a world power. You had the Assyrians, and then you had the Babylonians, and then you had the Persians. And compared to them, the people of God were laughable. I mean, you look at the Assyrian Empire, you look at the Babylonians, you look at the Persians, and you look at the people of God that are in Israel. God's people are weak and small and insignificant, and they're being pounded on by these world powers that are against them. Yet God's going to send his forces out against his enemies to deal with them righteously. And what we see here in Zechariah chapter 6 is God has established his rule over all worldly powers. He has subdued all rebellion, and he exercises dominion over all the earth. The reason we know this is, look at the last verse, in verse 8. Then he cried to me, behold, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country. The reason his spirit is able to rest is because all the enemies in the north, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, they've all been dealt with. God has sent his forces out to deal with them. He's dealt with them. He's subdued them. He's put all rebellion under his foot. And now God's spirit's at rest because there's nothing left to take care of. So God exercises his rule and dominion over all of these worldly powers. I look at that and it gives me hope for today. Because I understand if this was the situation of the people of God in the Old Testament, they were weak, they were insignificant, they had no power, they had no authority, they had enemies that were facing them. How much more so is that true of us, the church of God? Yes, the church of God is weak. I'll just be fully honest with you. I struggle with this constantly. Because I go home and I watch TV. And what do I see on TV? I see a multi-million-dollar program that has had every professional on the planet put it together to be aired before millions of people. And then I get up here on Sunday morning, and it's me with no shoes. There is a big difference between me and a multi-million-dollar program on TV. I look at the world, and we're trying to give a message that Christ saves and Christ redeems, and there's hope only found in Jesus Christ. And yet we live in a culture that tells you that there is no God, that God is dead and long gone. And they have all of the power, they have all of the authority, they have all of the music, they have all of the culture, they have some of the best songs in the world. And yet we look at them and say, compared to that, we are so weak and so insignificant, we might as well close our doors. Except, though we may be weak, our God is not. Our God is mighty, and he's far mightier. And essentially, that is what this vision is about in Zechariah chapter 6. Yes, the church is weak, but God is mighty, and he is close to his people. And it has two very distinct messages. It does have a message to the world. He reminds us from the second vision in Zechariah chapter 2 to not touch the apple of his eye. Remember, God's people are the apple of his eye, precious and close to his heart. The message to the world, for a lost and dying world, those who would be opposed to the church, those who would be opposed to the message of Jesus Christ, would be this: don't touch the apple of God's eye. God will deal with all of his enemies righteously and justly, and he will protect and stand up for his people. The world may be strong and the church may be weak, but our God is mighty. The message of the world is don't mess with God's people. But the message to us, those who believe in Jesus Christ, is to be reminded that we will advance, not by might, not by strength. We will advance by the grace of God and God's power and not worldly power. Why in the world would we seek worldly power to advance our agenda, to advance our cause, when God is going to destroy all worldly powers? The only power that we should seek after is the power of God and God's working and God's Spirit. And by the grace of God, send out our message that Jesus Christ saves. As we read these visions, we come to a resolution to not see Babylon as great and see Jerusalem as small. There's been a story of two cities, Babylon representing the world and Jerusalem representing the people of God. And often that's a temptation. That's the temptation for every teenager that grows up and every college student that goes off to school and every kid that goes off to school. We see this and we want to come into the world and we want to look at the world and we say, man, the world is so great and the world is so significant and the world is so powerful. I might as well just give up on my faith. I might as well just quit. This church stuff is just so small and so weak and so insignificant. Why should I even bother dedicating the rest of my life to following Christ and pursuing after God? I mean, that's the temptation. I'll be honest with you, if us adults are honest, that's the temptation for adults, right? I mean, what's the point of us getting up and getting dressed and coming to church and worshiping God together? We can just stay home and we can just be comfortable, and everything that we need the world will give us. Because Babylon is great and Jerusalem is small. Because the world is great and because God is insignificant. But these visions would remind us that that is a false lie. That is exactly the opposite. That as great and significant as this world seems and as Babylon seems, it pales in comparison to Almighty God. And it will not stand before his righteous, holy, working, divine providence in his creation. We see this in the very pattern of these visions. So we've had 8 visions so far. And if we could, imagine that this pulpit is God's people, represents the people of God. For the Old Testament, those that belong to the nation of Israel that worship God. For the New Testament, those of us that belong to the church that worship through Jesus Christ. And what we see in these visions is this idea that God returns to his people. I remember Zechariah chapter 1, return to me and I will return to you. And so through the first 4 visions, God is returning to his people, restoring them, giving them a second chance. And as he gets closer to his people, we see these 2 great rulers, Joshua and Zerubbabel, the priest and the king, who will ultimately, you got to come back next week to see this part, but ultimately be united in Jesus Christ. We're going to talk about that next week. Ultimately, but as God gets closer to his people, what we see in the last 4 visions is this: God comes close to his people, and the closer he gets, the further away sin and wickedness gets. So God deals with wickedness among his people and removes wickedness from them. Now God goes to the nations, and he deals with wickedness among the nations. This is the story of God's providential care and what he's doing on this creation, on this earth. He hasn't just made it and then abandoned it. He draws close to his people, and as he does, he sends wickedness and sin out from his presence. If that doesn't sound familiar, let me remind you that this is exactly what God is doing through us in Jesus Christ. The theme is the centrality of our relationship with God by faith through grace in Jesus. And as we draw close to him, God is expelling out of us through his sanctifying work the sin and wickedness in our hearts and in our community, and he's drawing us up to him, in which one day we will be resurrected and no longer be in the presence of sin, but be in the presence of a holy, almighty God. This is what God is doing. Return to me and I will return to you. He's drawing close to us and drawing sin away from us. He's drawing close to us and he's making us holy in his image through Jesus Christ. It's the same message. But for Zechariah, the community was built around the temple. For us, our community is built around Jesus Christ. It's great news for us who are believers to know that God actively cares for his people providentially. But if you're an unbeliever that's here today, please, I beg of you, don't mistake God's patience in your life. The temptation would be to say, I haven't seen God do that. I continue to sin, and God just doesn't do anything about it. I want to remind you that throughout Scripture, God is a patient and long-suffering God. But when the measure of sin is full, God acts swiftly and mightily and brings judgment quickly upon those who rebel against him. Our only hope is not our good deeds, it's not our righteous works. Our only hope is faith in Jesus Christ. If you're here today and you're an unbeliever, we would call you to the same faith. To understand this God who providentially cares for his people by finding grace that is found only through Jesus Christ. My hope today for those of you who are believers is that you will face the world with a new confidence. Stop worrying. I really did. I debated all week. How do I say that? What's a nice way to tell people you need to quit worrying? I don't think there's a nice way. The best way I can say it is this: your God is greater, and he providentially cares for you. We look at the world and we say, my God's bigger. And I trust that he's good and he's loving and he's everything that I need. So why in the world would I worry about anything? Just stop it. That's the best way I can say it.